Shana's daf is daf Yud, and the Gemara actually starts on daf Tesla base on the bottom, so we will begin from there. Okay. Itmar, we learned 4 lines on the bottom of the page of Tesla base. So we learned our 4 activities, 4 avodas by a korban. There's a shchita, there's the Kabbalah receiving the blood, there's the halacha, then transporting it to the mizbeach, and then there is the zrika, the sprinkling it on the mizbeach. Where do the owners of the korban get involved with the korban? Only the zrika. The zrika is the only part that's where they're involved, because the zrika is their kapara. And bearing that in mind, we have an interesting argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. And the argument is, we have a concept called pigul. Pigul is, if I shecht a korban and I have in mind that we're gonna eat it in 3 days from now, and then, which is the wrong time. The din is that even if you eat it at the correct time, you're chayiv kares. That's the law of pigul. Same thing is, if I have in mind I'm going to sprinkle on the mizbeach in 3 days from now, and a korban obviously has a very finite window, so this is outside of that time, outside that window, that korban becomes possible because it is pigul. But if I shechted a korban and I had in mind to shecht in the wrong place or the wrong time, there's no pigul. There's 2 kinds of pigul. There's pigul with the wrong time and pigul the wrong place. Pigul with the wrong time, I had in mind in 2 days from now to sprinkle, and even though I sprinkled in the correct time, everything else, if somebody eats a korban, they chayiv kares. If you had in mind that this animal should be eaten outside of the correct place, for example, kachim, you had in mind to eat it outside the base of Mikdash, or kachim kalim outside of Yerushalayim, there's a lav, but there's no kares involved. Okay, so let's get now to the subject matter here between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. So the case over here is, we're talking about this whole Gemara here is two concepts, either Shinu Kodesh or Shinu Bailim. Either you had the wrong, you shechted a korban without having the right kavanah in mind, Shaloi Lishma, or you had the wrong person in mind. So what happens, you shechted the korban and you had in mind that you had the correct korban in mind at the shchita, but you said, but I'm going to sprinkle the blood for this animal, but I'm going to have in mind another korban. Do we say that it's possible or not? Because you're not discussing this very avodah you're doing, that you did correctly. I'm having in mind another avodah. Are the avodas like, contiguous to each other, and you can shift, having in mind during the avodah A to have in mind avodah D, or not really? So the Gemara says, "It no bilin. Shachti shechted lishma. You shechted correctly the animal, but you had in mind to sprinkle the blood for the wrong korban." Is Rabbi Yochanan said psula? Rabbi Yochanan is possible because even though you were doing shchita right now, but you had in mind the wrong thing for the zrika. And Rish Lakish says ksheira. Rish Lakish says each avodah is isolated from the next, is solo, and therefore at the time of shchita you can only think about shchita, and whatever your thoughts are about zrika are irrelevant. He said, you can think from one avodah to the next. And where does he learn that concept from? The Alfina Machshav Pigul. I just told you that Pigul is you shecht and you have in mind that you're going to sprinkle the blood a couple of days later. So we see Pigul, you have in mind from one avodah to the next. And Rish Lakish says, Ksheira, why? You cannot mechashe from one avodah to the next. Pigul, you don't learn from Pigul. Why don't you learn from Pigul? So the Rashi explains very nicely. By Pigul, you're not thinking from one avodah to the next. The whole idea of Pigul is regarding the eating. You have the wrong kavanas about eating. It happens to be, so if I think that we're going to eat it 2 days from now, that's Pigul. If I think that we are going to we're going to put it on the mizbeach, the fats 2 days from now, that's the mizbeach's eating. That is pigul. If I think that I am going to sprinkle the blood 2 days from now, you know why it's possible? Not because it's one of the avodas. It's because that is eating. The mizbeach eats either through sprinkling or putting the fats on the mizbeach. And pigul is all about eating. Nothing to do with having one thought by doing one avodah and thinking about another avodah. That's the Shlokish's view. So therefore, Said the Gemara. In fact, we have a very similar argument to Reichel Shlakish about another matter, nothing to do with Kabbalas, but the same principle. What we learned. You shechted an animal, and you had in mind that if you shechted an animal, obviously it's avodah zara. The animal is asabana. Here you shechted the animal, all right, but you said I'm going to sprinkle the blood for avodah zara. Or lahakti chelba avodah chavim. I'm going to roast the fats for avodah zara. Rabbi Yechon says asura, the animal is forbidden to have anah mechashvin ma'avodah la'avodah. While you're shechting, you can think about other activities. And the Yalfin and Chutzapnim. And we'll learn from the Beis Hamikdash and Pigul, so sort of two steps. You can think from one Avodah to the next, and we're going to compare Avodah Zara to Pigul inside, Chutz, things, activities you do outside the Beis Hamikdash from activities you do within the Beis Hamikdash. However, the Shlakish says, Muteres, it is permitted. Why? Because Ein Mechashvin Ma'avodah La'avodah. While you're shechting, you cannot think about the Zrika. It's a meaningless exercise. And you don't learn, and furthermore, you don't learn activities from outside, from inside. Says the Gemara. So the obvious question is, what do you need both for? You have two machlekes in the same principle. Why both? So the Gemara will say, because if we only knew one, we would not know what their opinions would be regarding the other one. So, for example, the Ashmin Bahavi only knew the case of Avodah Zarah because it was happening outside the base of Midrash. I can argue, maybe Baham and Shlakish. Only over here the Shlakish argues because this has nothing to do with the Kabbalas. But if within the base of Midrash itself, you were shechting correctly, but you had in mind the Zrika Shaloi Lishma, maybe we do compare it to Pigul. Maybe it's Maida, and then maybe it's possible. So if you only knew the case of the Beis Hamikdash where you shechted and you had in mind the Zrika, and there we have an argument in Shlokish of Yechon, I would say only over there he argued because we learned from Pigul. When it comes to Avodah Zara, which is totally unrelated to Pigul, Ema Maida Leil Rav Shimon. Shlaki is Maida. Therefore, you need both. It's definitely Avodah Zara anyway. We're talking now about where the animal becomes Asa Bahana. As the Gemara, Ki Asa Ravdimi came along. Amar, he said, Masiv Rabbi Yirmiyah brought a proof to support the view of Rabbi Yechanan. If you could think from one avodah to the next, and you can ruin the animal. And Rabbi Ela brought Lisiyu proof to the Shlakish. So now the Gemara explains what these proofs are. Rabbi Yechanan, and this purely a kal v'chaim logic. If he says, if he says, I'm going to shecht and have in mind that this shechita should take place outside of the time. First of all, it's nonsense, because you're shechting right now. What do you mean you're going to shecht outside of the time? Doesn't make sense. It's one thing while you're shechting, you're having in mind you're going to eat at the wrong time or sprinkle the blood, because you're not doing the sprinkling right now. It's something you're going to do in the future, so you're planning different, the wrong thing. So it's nonsense, and also because technically, we know that Pigul is only to do with Zrika. So if he says Al Shech Chutzes Mane, the animal is kosher, and yet Shochta Menasel is Roigdama Chutzes Mane possible, but if he shechts in order to sprinkle the blood, it is possible. So Mokim She'im Amar, in a place where he says Hareini Sheichet Shaloilishma, in a place where the shechita actually is effective. If he shechts with having the wrong kavanah in mind, possible. If he shechted with the wrong carbon in mind, it is possible. Then surely shachta manas lizik dama. If he shechted thinking that he's going to sprinkle the blood for the wrong carbon, surely she possible. That's the kal v'chayim. That shechita shalei lishma is obviously easier to make the animal ruin the animal. So surely if he shechted and had in mind that the zrika shalei lishma, the animal should be possible. Maskil or Rabbi Bariloi, what are you talking about? He said, you know why maybe? No, I disagree. I don't think it's kal v'chaim at all. You want to know why, even though you shecht the animal thinking that you're going to shecht it the wrong place is meaningless. But if you shecht it thinking you're going to sprinkle the blood the wrong time, it's possible. It's because we're very machmir with pigul. You know why? If you go ahead and eat it, even though you actually ate it within the right time, you'll still get kaddish. Oh, because it's so strict. Therefore, even though you had this wrong thing in mind during the shechita, it ruins the animal. But when it comes to shaloi lishmai, there's no kaddish involved with it. Who said if while you're shechting and you're thinking that I'm going to sprinkle the blood and having in mind a different carbon, it ruins the carbon? Who said? This is the kal v'chaim.
And we just have a snack when
If somebody can please mute themselves.
have a late lunch there or something, and when you get home, just have.
Mute yourself, please.
Uma mokum. Ma mokum she'im amar hadeini sheichit chutz l'mekaymet. So let's take it down a notch. We're not talking about pigul, which is chutz l'zmane. There you get kares. We're talking about pigul where you had in mind chutz l'mekaymet. Chutz l'mekaymet means you had in mind you're going to eat it outside of the correct place. You can eat it outside of Yerushalayim, outside of the base of English. And there's no kares involved. And yet it's the same rule that it only applies while you're shechting and you have in mind the zrika in the wrong place. So let's make the kavachem from there. He says, I'll shecht it outside of the place, shu kosher, which is the outside of the place that it's kosher because if you said, I'm going to shecht outside the place, there's no laws of pigul by shchita. Plus it's an impossibility because you're shechting right here. And yet, shachta, if you shechted and you had in mind, to sprinkle the blood outside the place, possible. So you see, you're doing one activity, having in mind another activity, and it's possible. Surely, markham in a place where the shechita itself is no good. If you have in mind, if you had in mind the wrong carbon is possible, then surely, if you had in mind to sprinkle the blood, surely it is Einudin Shei Puzzles Repuzzle. Same Kavachaimer, but we're not talking about Karas anymore, so don't throw at me, oh, but Pigul is Karas, and therefore we're stricter. No, Masker of Ashi, even so, there's still a Chumrah involved in Pigul, which is Chutzl Mekaimer, that you don't have in Loy Lishmoy. So that's why maybe over there by Pigul Chutzl Mekaimer, you shechted and you had another activity, a Zrika in mind, the wrong Kavana, it ruins the animal. But who said it ruins it by Loy Lishmoy? What's the Chumrah? Any carbon, if you behave this way, it ruins the carbon. Remember, this psul of Loy Lishmoy only applies to carbon chatas and carbon pesach. Only those two carbonos. So it's very limited. It's a much lesser, weaker iser. So maybe it only applies to where you had the thought. But if while I'm shechting, I'm thinking about another activity, who said it has any impact on it? Ela Ravashi. Ravashi says, you're right. I'm going to give you a new kavachema. And goes as follows. Nothing to do, the kavachema is not from learning from Shinui Shem, but from Shinui Bailim. And that is, now remember, Shinui Bailim only applies to Zrika. While I'm shechting, I have in mind to sprinkle the blood for another person. And why only by Zrika? Because the only relationship between the owner of the animal and the animal is the Zrika part. The Shchita, the Kabbalah, the Loch, it's all the domain of the Kohanim. So therefore the Kalachim goes as follows. Ma b'mokum, ma in a place. But he says, Hareini sheichid l'shem pleni. I'll shecht it for that person. Shu kosher, nothing happened. The animal's kosher. But if he had in mind lizrak domay l'shem pleni, if he had in mind to sprinkle the blood for somebody else, puzzle is puzzle. It is possible. So therefore, she'im amar. Surely, if he says hareini sheichit shaloi l'shman puzzle, here it's stricter because even if you shechted shaloi l'shman, the shechit itself is puzzle. So shachtu amanas these are dom l'shman ain't a din shehe puzzle. Surely here, if he had in mind shaloi l'shman to sprinkle the blood shaloi l'shman, surely it should be puzzle. Says the Gemara. So that's Rav Ashi's Kavachaymer, and we remain with that to support Rabbi Yechon, pure logic. So what's the support to Reish Lakish? Says the Gemara. What support the Reish Lakish? The following we had before, number of psukim to teach you that shchita has to be done l'shem the right carbon and the Kabbalah, the halacha. And so too the zrika. Now, why do you need 4 psukim? What happens if the Torah would have omitted the pasuk for zrika? We would have known regardless that zrika needs lishma. Why? Because we would have learned it from shchita and kabbalah. You put the two together. Basically, a carbon has to be done lishma for the right reason. Why does the Torah add another pasuk for zrika? You know why? To tell you that each avodah you have to have its own bad thoughts to ruin it. Only if it's loy lishmai during zrika, then it's possible. But if while you're shechting, you're thinking that the zrika should be loy lishmai, it doesn't work. That's why you have an extra pasuk. Says the Gemara, the light time bezika. Why do we need the pasuk zrika? But takes it but let's learn kavachim benayu between shchit and kabbalah. The my hilchas a kasar achmana. Why did the Torah write it down? Let me to tell you. The ein mechashrin ma'avodah lavodah, to tell you that zrika you'll only be puzzled if during the zrika you had the wrong thoughts in mind. Maskir or Papa says, how do you know? Maybe the other way around. Maybe the Dilma the Mechashim Avodah Avodah. Maybe the Torah wrote the pasuk on the contrary. I'm giving an extra pasuk as extra to teach you the halacha that while you're shechting, you had the wrong thought in mind. For Zrika, it does render the animal puzzle. How do you know which way to go? Says the Gemara, he answers back. Im kain, if so, lishtek kramine, say nothing. And then v'teisim mekavochem Rashi. If the din is like Rabbi Yechanan, that you could be mechashem avodah avodah, well, we have Rabbi Ashi's kavochem from the case of Shini Bailim, and say nothing by Zika. And then I would know that while you're shechting, you had the wrong thing in mind by Zika, it's possible. Why does the Torah write the extra pasuk? To tell you that when it comes to Zrika or any avodah, if you want to ruin it, it's only if at the time of that avodah, you had the wrong thought in mind. The idach. And the other one, but what does he say? Why taka do you need the pasuk? Parich, he says, no, there's no kal v'chem. You couldn't, the reason why the Torah had to have a pasuk for Zrika, because you could not learn Zrika from Shchita and Kabbalah. And why not? Because Shchita and Kabbalah have chumras that Zrika doesn't have. So maybe there you need Lishma and not by Zrika. What chumras do they have? Parachachi, Malahanach, you know what Shchita and Kabbalah have? She came to Unat Tzafin by a korban chatas that have to be done on the north side of the courtyard. The Yeshna Bechatois Apinimis, and you have a korban chatas that's done on the inner in the inner mizbeach, and you do the shchita there and the Kabbalah there. But on the other hand, when it comes to the outside, the zrika, there's no chatas primis that does zrika on the outside mizbeach. So therefore, there's a chumrah in shchita and Kabbalah, and we would have thought only those need lishma and not zrika. V'idach, what's Rabbi going to answer to that? This entire pasuk where we're learning all these dinim regarding lishma, we're learning from korban shlamim. So what are you throwing me a chumrah by korban chatas? True, chatas the same din applies, but we're not learning from chatas, we're learning from shlamim. And by shlamim does not have to be in the north side. Shlamim done only on the outside mizbeach. They're all the same. In Gemara says, "Itma," you should know that this machlekes is not limited only to Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish. We actually have other Amoraim have the same machlekes. Itma we learned shachta lishma, lizak damash lishma. Shachta lishma, having in mind to sprinkle the blood shaloi lishma. Is Rav Nachman? Rav Nachman says it is possible because, like Rabbi Yechanan, we can go from one activity to the next. And Rabbah says kosher because he holds Reish Lakish. You cannot go from one activity to the next. And then later on, Rabbah changed his mind. Why? Because of the Kavochem Rabashi, was persuaded by the Kavochem Rabashi that by Shine Bailim, where by Shchita doesn't work, but only by during Shechting you had in mind Zika, it ruins it. So Kavochem, surely by Shchita does ruin the animal. Surely if you had during Shchita in mind the Zika, it ruins the animal. Then we're continuing to explain the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Lezer, you said that only Chatas and Pesach, a Chatas all year round, and a Pesach only Bizmane. If you had the wrong thing in mind, it ruins it. Comes along, Rabbi Lezer adds also a korban usher. So what's going on here? Why is Rabbi Lezer add a korban usher? What's his basis? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Lezer says, Pasha to logic. Chatas bar lachet. What do you bring a korban chatas for? Because of a sin. And ba'asher bar lachet. Now what's a korban usher for a sin? Ma chatas, just like a chatas shaloi lishma psula. If he did the loy lishma, it's possible. Af usher, so to an usher shaloi lishma. If he did the loy lishma, it's possible. It's possible. Simple. Usher is for a sin. Why should it be different? Just 1 second. Not so simple. You know, chatas is very different than usher, and therefore you cannot equate the two. Where do you see the difference? She came domo lamaila by a korban chatas. There's a red line that goes around this bed, and learn all about it later on in Zevachim. And where do you sprinkle the blood of a korban chatas? Above the line. Where do you sprinkle the blood of a korban oila? Below the line. When it comes to a bird, it's exactly the opposite. By a bird, we say the chatas of a bird is below the line, and the oila of a bird is above the line. But by animals, the korban chatas is above and oila is below, and all the other korbanos are below. It's only a chatas. So it's and the asham is below. So it's very different. How can you learn one another? Oh my Lord, Rabbi Lezer response to me says, what do you mean? Pesach echich. Remember, a korban Pesach bismana, if you had the wrong korban in mind, it's ruined. And yet a korban Pesach, where do you sprinkle the blood? Below the line. So we see that the below the line, above the line has no bearing on it. Should the matter. And yet, v'shok l'ishmai possible. V'shok l'ishmai possible. I'm going to be sure. 1 second. Pesach has its own chumrah. Ma'ale Pesach shekain's manekvu has a very short window. And on the other hand, a korban asham is available year round. There's no special window. So Pesach has this terrible chumrah that has only a short window. Therefore, a Pesach you have to have in mind the right korban. We see that the idea of having a short window has no bearing because the carbon chat is also year round, and yet if you have the wrong thing in mind, it's possible. So the truth of the matter, go back and forth. He'll say, okay, chatas is above the line. So he'll say, look at the Pesach, below the line. But Pesach is a short window. Look at chatas, doesn't have a short window. Normally, what we would say is, well, what we do is we keep on going and then we would say, well, what's the common denominator? The common denominator is the kabbalas. They're both to do with sins, and you shech which one? And you shech the loy l'shmai. They both have both kabbalas. You shech the loy l'shmai. They're apostle. That's what we should have said. But the Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara will discuss later. Gemara will go and analyze this whole discussion between Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Lezer in a minute. So Rabbi Shua said, "Pazani Chalila, I can go in circles." So instead of Rabbi Lezer saying no, so since each chumrah is different, let's look what's in common. And common is that they're carbon, kachim, and if you had the wrong thing in mind, it ruins it. He didn't say that. Instead, Chazar Rabbi Lezer. He said, you know what? I'll give you another basis for my svara. V'dana dinacha. And he comes up with a whole other svara. He says as follows: Chatas nema bohi. Says actually who? By chatas it says in the pasuk who. It says chatas who. Chatas who means that it is a chatas, right? And you have to make sure you do it l'shem chatas. Don't have any other kabbalas in mind. And so chatas nema bohu b'shchita. So who lishma ksheda shlosh absolute. Since it talks about shchita, it says b'mokum shishchas ha'oluf ne'Hashem chatasu. Since because we're talking about shchita and it says chatasu, you have to have in mind the chatas. Lo lishma is possible, and so on. Upesach nema by who? By Korban Pesach also. It says over there by Martin Zeva Pesach hu Hashem. So Korban Pesach, we know you have to do it the sake for Korban Pesach. Bezvicha, it says Zeva Pesach, but Shechting kosher shaloi lishma possible. So he says, Af Osham. When you look in the pasuk where it talks about Osham, it says, it should be Mizbech. It says, Isha la Hashem, Osham who? Same thing. You have to have in mind an Osham. Remember, who lishmoi kosher, so the same way you learn by Chatas and by Pesach, with the word who, we have the same word who by Osham. Rabbi Shua said, we had it before already. How can you compare? Where is the word who written by Korban Chatas at the time of Shechting? When you shecht, have it right in your mind. By Korban Pesach, Zeva Pesach, the time of shechting. But by Korban Osham, where does it say who? It says v'hiktir. After you're roasting it, it have to say who. How can you tell me that the roasting has to be L'Shem Shemayim when we learned before already? Even if you didn't do any roasting of the limbs, you put nothing on the mizbeach. If you went through the first 4 activities, the animal's already kosher. So how can you tell me by Osham the word who is coming to limit it that you have to do it L'Shma? Where it's written in the pasuk is very after by the Haktadas, which is by the Haktorah on the Mizbech, which really is not ma'ak, it doesn't hold anything back. Who b'shchita, who lishma k'shelish rapsula, because it says by shchita, it has to be done correctly. Pesach by who b'zvicha, who lishma kosher, lishma pasuk, has to be done correctly. Abel Osham, whenever by who. Where is written the word who by Osham? Ela achan haktorah semurin. Only the pasuk where it says the hiktir oisam hakoyin mizbeach. You should roast him on the mizbeach, and then it says Osham who. Even if you didn't go through that whole stage at all, you didn't put anything on mizbeach. The animal is kosher as long as you went through the first 4 steps, shechting, and you did the sprinkling. So therefore, what's your proof? See, now he comes up with a third idea. There's a pasuk where it says kachatas ka'osham toida achas lehem. They both have the same laws. Clearly, that osham is similar to chatas. Well, chatas loy lishma is possible. Same thing by osham. Ma chatas loy lishma possible. Af osham lishma possible. So that's his argument. That's Rabbi Lezer's basis. And now the Gemara is going to go through discussion and try to understand what Rabbi Shua was saying. Rabbi Shua could have said other things. Rabbi Lezer could have said other things. Why didn't they? Same thing, Gemara. Let's go back to what we just mentioned before when he said each one has a chumrah. So the Chayil could have just said, well, there's a tzad hashava between Pesach and Chatas. They're both kochim. They're both kabbalas, and they're both if you did as well as Shema, it's possible. So because you were saying Pesach has a fixed time, zman kavua, and it has a chumrah, and Chatas you do above the red line. But why doesn't Rabbi Lezer just say, well, Tzad HaShavah? Says the Gemara, why did he come up with a new idea? Says the Gemara, we learned, sorry, I just lost the place. I go circles, There's a license mitzvah. So why don't we do the normal standard thing? Whenever this happens, we have one chumrah here, a separate chumrah there. You go, what's the common denominator? So why did Abelazar just say that? So you want to know why? Even the common denominator, really, you cannot learn Asham from them. You know why? Because they have something in common, a common chumrah. What's the common chumrah that Asham doesn't share with them? If you don't bring Korban Pesach, you get karas. A Korban Chatas, if you didn't deliberately, you get karas. On Asham, there's no karas on the Avedas that Asham is there to atone for. So maybe the din of the Shema does not apply to Asham. That's why he has to bring other sources. Rabbi Shua, then we're continuing to go through the conversation. Rabbi said, right? Rabbi Shua says, what do you compare? Chatz is so different. The blood is sprinkled above. So why didn't Rabbi Shua give another difference? If you bring the blood of a chatas inside, it ruins. Sorry, the korban chatas is the only korban that sometimes you bring it on the mizbeach haprimi on Yom Kippur. You bring the korban chatas inside. You don't do it by an asham, so they're very different. How can you? So chatas is such a such an elated carbon, such a significant carbon. Maybe that's why Shaloi L'Shmai ruins it. So the Gemara, we're focusing on chatois hachitzonis. That's a red herring talking about a chatzah primis. As far as chatois hachitzonis is concerned, Asham should be the same as chatzah L'Shmai L'Shmai is possible. That's why he didn't bring that in. So the Gemara says, okay, why don't you bring the following? Talk about chatzas chitzanis. There's another difference between chatzas and asham. She'im nichnas damal lefnayin if psula. Take a chatzas, bring the blood inside when you shouldn't have. You should sprinkle it out. You brought it inside. It passes. And by a korban asham, it doesn't. Only a korban chatzas is as yuvim medama. Kol chatzas yuvim medama rules it. Not by korban asham. So the Gemara says, Isa Rabbi Lezer. You know why he didn't bring it up? Because Rabbi Lezer taka holds afa asham. Rabbi Lezer holds that on asham also. You could bring the blood inside, it ruins the carbon. So there's no difference between a chatas and asham. Says the Gemara, okay, why don't we say another difference is she came mechaperes a chayav krisis. Why don't we say another difference? The carbon chatas is so significant that he can atone for even someone who's doesn't have Veda, which is a tag to krisis. Asham doesn't. Says the Gemara, who said he's learning from those chatois? He's learning mechatas the shmi is a koil. Remember, there were the three chatas, which is the ones that are commensurate to your economic status. And there, for example, a chatas that you knew testimony and you said, I don't know any testimony, to not your lie. You have to bring karma chatas oil of the yoted. And over there, if you had loy l'shma, it's possible. And there's no chorus there. So there, Asham is very similar. So therefore, maybe Asham also should be possible. That's what Rabbi Lezer says. So the Gemara says, why don't you make another difference? By karma chatas, she came to una arba matanas. A korban chatas you have to spray on all four walls, on all four corners, and what do you call it? By an asham you only need two. No, the korban chatas you got to spray 4 times in all 4 directions. A korban asham you sprinkle it 2 times on 2 opposite ends of the diagonally opposite in the mizbeach, but then it has to splatter across all the 2 dimensions next to it. So ultimately all 4 dimensions, but you only sprinkle twice. So here you have a chumrah by korban chatas, you don't have by asham, so you can't compare the 2. Says you want to know. He holds like Rabbi Shmuel, the Omer, who says, Rabbi Lezer holds like Rabbi Shmuel, that says, Kol adam mituna arba matanas. He holds that even a korban chatas, even asham requires 4 matanas, the 4 sprinkles. So the Gemara, there's another difference. Why doesn't he say a korban chatas is an arba karnas? Okay, it has to be 4. They're both the same, but by chatas you spray it on the corners protruding from the mizbeach, and the asham is on the wall of the mizbeach itself. That's another difference. So the Gemara says, if you're looking for differences, there are many differences. For example, the Gemara asks back to Rabbi Shua, to Gemara, what are you asking me? Why did Rabbi Shua add another difference? I'll tell you another difference. Why don't you add? You can ask more questions. But the time when it comes to asham, you take it in a vessel and you split the blood, and when it comes to chatas, you use your finger. Another difference. Ha'ika keren. There has to be mamish on the corner on the keren itself. Ha'ika chudin, on the keren has to be on the shop on the point of the keren, and then make a elongated line going down, and you don't do that by the other ones. Elachad mitreit last time in Noki. You have to make any difference. You just pick one at random, but there are other differences. Okay, then Gemara continues focusing on that discussion. Amar, you said. Amar, Rabbi Shua said, "Lo no im amrit." Rabbi Shua said, "Oh, one second. The korban chatas is above the line." Well, according to Rabbi Lezer, we are comparing Osham to Chatas, right? Chatas ka Osham. So Rabbi Lezer could have just answered, well, I hold that the Osham also is above the line. What do you ask me questions for? I hold that Osham and Chatas are the same. Like the Pasuk says, Chatas ka Osham. So I hold it's also above the line. Lema Rabbi Lezer could have said, Osham Nami, that an Osham also is above the line, that an Osham also is above the line, because he holds above the same. Omar Abaye says, no. Even Rabbi Lezer compares Osham to Chatas when it comes to Lishmai, but not when it comes to above the line. Why? Osham Dom you cannot say the above the line because we have a Kavachayim from a korban oil. A korban oil, in a way, is much stricter than an Osham. It gets totally burnt on Mizbeach. Yet where do you sprinkle it? Below the line. So how can Osham be stricter? Ma oil should call it gets completely burned Mizbeach. Dom Lamata, Osham She'ena call does not get completely burned. Lakoshkin surely should be below. 1 second. Ma'ala oila, an oila is below because it's not coming to be mechaper on averis. You can't any mechaperis. Even for mitzvah say we learned before already that you have to do tshuva, and the korban oil is merely a gift to Hashem. Mashain the korban oshim is a kapara that's similar to chatas, so maybe it has to be above the line. Timur says no, not every kapara is above the line. Look at chatas oif. The bird chatas is brought below the line. So one second. It means it's not an animal. Talk about animals. Well, oil is an animal, and you have to bring it below the line. Here we go back to that formula. Each one has a separate chumrah. What's common? That all of these chatas and oilers are kachim. The damalamata, the korban oil of the animal is brought below the line. The chatas oif is brought below the line. So therefore, the korban asham, because there's no pasuk for korban asham, and we have to work out our way, which way we should compare it to. What do we compare it to? Afani avi asham to korban asham below the line. That's why we didn't answer that. But that Rabbi Lezer holds above the line. Why don't we ask? You know what they both have in common? The oil and the oil, so both have in common. There's no fixed price. You can give as little or as much as you want, and therefore maybe that's why it's below the line. But time the chumra by asham, there's a fixed amount. 2 shkolim has to be a fixed amount, and maybe therefore it's very different, and we should compare it to chatos. You're being above the line. You know how he knows that Rabbi Lezer didn't respond because an asham definitely is below the line. But how do we know that? Because the pasuk says hakoyin hamechate oisa, that the koyin that is forgiving him oisa. So oisa, we're talking about korban chatas. It says the word oisa it. Why did it say it? Obviously, we're talking about the korban. Oisa double the mile. Only the chatas the blood is above. Ain't domishal achal mile, but no other korban is above the line. So we're asking the question: if we are going to be so pedantic and we're going to focus on the word oisa, so let's use the word oisa also for lishmoi. So Yehachi, if so, chatas nami nema say oisa lishma ksheira shaloi lishma psula. Because in another pasuk it says that you should place your hand on the chatas and v'shachat oisa lechatas. And before the Gemara we had that was one of the basis for the idea of lishma, because it says v'shachat oisa lechatas, shech it for chatas. So let's hone in on the word oisa and say that only chatas has to be lishma, but not a korban asham. The same logic he just said about the line, above the line, below the line. Hosha is why you say oisa lishma ksheira lishma psula. Hosha is welcome any other korban, including an asham ben lishma ksheira. Says Gemara, no. Ahu oisa, this oisa in that pasuk, lav davka. That oisa in that pasuk is not necessarily saying limiting to korban pesach. How do I know that? This pasuk which says oisa lechatas, you want to say that what? That this is the only animal that has to be lishma, but it's not true. A korban pesach also has to be lishma according to everybody. Korban pesach bisman, if you had the wrong thing in mind, it ruins the korban. So obviously, even though it says oisa here, it didn't really mean oisa. This is the only korban. Hoshai Pesach. Hachanami lav dafke. The Hoshai oilus. Gemara says, sorry. Hoshai Pesach. So lav dafke. So if so, when it comes to above the line and it says oisa by a korban chatas, and you're telling me it means only a korban chatas above the line, and therefore we exclude an asham, but it's not true. As we mentioned before, oilas ha'oif, a bird, is also above the line. So even though it says oisa, it didn't mean literally only it. Is hachanami lav dafke. The Hoshai oilus ha'oif. Says the Gemara, that's not a problem because we're talking about an animal. By an animal, nothing was left out. All animals are below the line except the karmechatas. Therefore, an asham also below the line. When it comes to lishma, it says oisa, but we know karm pesach has to be lishma as well. So obviously, he wasn't particular. That's one answer. Or he buys another answer is this follows a lot of Shimon who says, in fact, it is very particular. When it says oisa, when it comes to above the line, it means only a karmechatas. What about the bird? The bird oila, even though the bird oila is above the line, but not in the same place. What do you mean not in the same place? Because the Amar Rabbi Shimon says, "Hai makom l'chud v'hai makom l'chud." Where you put the blood of the karmechatas is not the same place where you put the blood of an oila sa'if. What's that all about? The time we learned. When we say below the line, anywhere below the line. Well, yoinim, but above the line, the chud sikul anywhere above the line. Doesn't matter where. But Omar Abelazar Shimon, no. But Medra Mudi Boilus Eik. We come to anywhere a piece above the line is good enough. Aval Bechatas Be'ema. He atzma ein nasa ella al gufishal keren. I don't want it on the wall, not on the panel. I want it on the four horns sticking out of his back that's protruding. It has to be on the keren itself. So therefore, oisa, and that's why Abelazar didn't answer that Asham is above the line because he actually holds that Asham is below the line. Says about it further, Tanan Hassam, we learned over there. Kiva said, now we mentioned about being blood being brought inside, that only a karmachatas, if you brought the blood inside, is possible. Now let's see if that's correct. Rabbi Kiva said, and we said that all other kabbanas, you bring the blood inside, it's not possible. Only a karmachatas, right? Because the pasuk says it, any chatas. Says the Gemara, it's not so simple. It's actually a machlekes. 4 lines to the bottom. It's not how to be learned over there. So Rabbi Kiva said, any blood that was brought inside the base of Mikdash, any blood, any blood you brought inside the base of Mikdash, the carbon is possible. That's what Rabbi Kiva's view is. And the Chachamim know only chatas bavad, only karma chatas, because the pasuk says v'chol chatas asher yuva middama. Only a chatas, so you brought the blood inside. And Rabbi Lezer says. Afa Osham. Rabbi Lezer says also a carbon Osham. If you brought inside, because an Osham is just like a Chatas. Similar view as we had before, that Rabbi Lezer said that an Osham is like a Chatas. And then it says, Kachatas ka Osham. Says the Gemara. Bishmaim Rabbi Lezer kidam time. We understand Rabbi Lezer very well. The Osham is like a Chatas, you brought the blood inside, it ruins it. And the Rabbanan my time, but the Rabbanan, why did the Rabbanan say by an Osham he brought the blood inside, it doesn't ruin it? Why not? Omar Rabba says, Rabba, Osham. We cannot say by an asham, just like we said before, you cannot say by an asham above the line is possible. Neither can you say if you brought the blood inside is possible. And why not? Because the kalbochayim from oila. Same thing we had before, same logic. It cannot be that an asham should be stricter than an oila. Ma oila, he called the entire oila gets burnt on his back. Yet nicht the dam lifnim trade. If you brought the blood inside, it's kosher. Everyone agrees that an oila is kosher. Because it says a pasuk, the chol chatos ashiyuvim medamber. Our only argument is regarding the Rabbanan are arguing with Rabbi Lezer regarding a carbon asham, do we equate it to a chatas or not? But an oila definitely, according to, except Rabbi Kiva, they held you brought it inside as kosher. Asham she'enu kol asham is much weaker, doesn't get burned back like kosher, surely it should be kosher. 1 second, saying, Mara, ma'ala oila, you know why an oila should can't enu mechaperes? An oila has nothing to do with kapara. And therefore, nothing, if you brought the blood inside, who cares? But the carbon asham is a kapara, stricter, maybe it should be rude. So we answer, minchas choyte techiach. The mincha of a choyte should bring a proof. What do you mean? A sinner brings a flower offering. One of the options is to bring a flower offering, and this is if you have a carbon oil v'yoda, let's say your new testimony, you withheld it. If you're very poor, you're dali dalus, you bring a flower offering, and you bring a flower offering which is a kapara, and yet if you brought it inside the base of Mikdash, it's not tummy because it doesn't get ruined because only blood gets ruined. It's not blood. So the Gemara says, why are you bringing, if you want to, support yourself, why bring a minchas chayte with no blood? Make a bigger chiddush. Why don't you make a bigger chiddush that a chatas where there is blood involved, if you brought it inside, even though it's a chatas, a kapara, it does not become ruined because only a chatas behemoth. The Gemara chatas because chatas is not so simple. Boy, did Rab Avinu. You know why we didn't bring chatas because Rab Avinu asked a question and he wasn't, and we never resolved it. Because on the one hand, it's a chatas and there's blood. On the other hand, it's not an animal. So what happens if you brought the blood inside? So we thought we'll bring minchas chayte, kapara, and you have to bring inside as kosher. Why don't we ask Mala Minchas Chayte Shekain Eimin Zevach? Why don't we just say back to him, what are you talking? What are you bringing Minchas Chayte for? Minchas Chayte is not an animal. Well, and therefore, if you bring the blood, if you bring it inside the base of English, it's not possible. So the Gemara says, oil is an animal and it's blood, and you bring it inside, it's kosher according to everybody because it's not a chatas. The chazar hadin, we go back and forth. Again, each one has a chumrah that the other one doesn't have. The oil, he gets totally burnt in the mizbeach, and yet if you bring the blood inside, it is mutter and osham. Surely should be mutter. Then we said there's no kapara, so we bring minchas chayt, it's a kapara, yet it's kosher. And so they all have these, even though they have these chumras, yet they're lenient. So surely something which is lenient should be even more lenient. Hatzad and shavish, what's the common denomination? Kachim. They're all kachim. V'nichlas dam lefnim, you bring the blood inside, kshen the kosher. In other words, even though they have these chumras, we're very lenient. Is af ani ovi oshim. I'll bring the oshim shu kodesh kadoshim. V'nichlas dam lefnim is kosher. Says the Gemara, just finish this little piece here. Says the Gemara, Amalei Rabba beBarnish leRavashi. So Rabba Barnish said to Ravashi, the Lifreich Ma'ala Hatzad Hashovben, but there's something in common that they all have, which makes it different than the Ashram Shekain Ein Lehen Kitzma. The same we used before. There's no fixed amount, so it's a very different category. Tell you Ashram the Kitzma. So you're right. Forget this whole thing. You know what the logical rabban is? Why an Ashram is not included? Why we don't compare it to Chatas? Because the pasuk excludes it. The pasuk says the whole Chatas ashayuva mid dama from its blood. What do you mean its blood and not from an Ashram? Dama shel zuva le'dam shalach. Nuvi idach. But the Rabbi Lezer says an Ashram is compared to a Chatas. What does he do with the word dama? Its blood. Dama v'lei psara. That dama, its blood v'lei psara, not its meat. If you would have brought the meat, for example, of an ashram inside or of a chatas inside, it doesn't ruin it. But the blood can be from an ashram just as well. The idach, and what's the other opinion? Dam, dama. We learned two things. It could have said dam, and then we know from dam that it's not the meat. And then it says dama, its blood, but not the blood of an ashram. And the idach. And Ablezer says dam, dama like darish, doesn't ashram.